Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Markish and I am the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Requirements, Best Practices from Haworth on Creating the Agency Within. Today's featured speaker is Brad Ryder, Global Analyst at Haworth, Inc. Brad will be presenting alongside Mitch Bishop, Chief Marketing Officer of iRise. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including a Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd like to say thank you to iRise for sponsoring this event. At this time, I will turn it over to Mitch to get us started.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Thanks, everybody, for attending wherever you are. And what I'd like to do is set Brad up a little bit here with a brief conversation about visualization, and then Brad can go through the meat of the conversation and talk a little bit about how Haworth is leveraging visualization across a pretty broad spectrum of projects. So next slide, please. You know, we just got back from the Information Week 500 conference actually last week, and had an opportunity to meet with lots of CIOs. There were about 250 there, and the number one issue that seems to be on everybody's mind is cost cutting. And you know, the economy certainly has driven that kind of thinking and behavior over the last 12 months. And what we're seeing is that IT leaders have really cut about as much cost as they can out of hardware consolidation and data center consolidation. Next slide. And what they're really focused on now is how do they cut more cost out of IT, but do it in a way that improves business efficiency. And we're really seeing a focus on two issues. One, rationalizing and consolidating business software, not only for the cost savings and the reduced maintenance contracts with vendors, but you know, again, to improve business efficiency. We're seeing a lot of businesses that grew up in silos around a good economy that now need to kind of shed redundant systems and present a single face to the customer. And then on the next slide, the other thing that we hear a lot about is that IT leaders want to extend global sourcing options, and they're having a lot of trouble doing that because of bad communication and you know, fundamentally poor processes between customers or clients and their outsourcing partners. Next slide. You know, so the business analyst really is the critical link driving the success of these initiatives. And on the next slide, what we're seeing, though, is that business projects, software projects, fail more often than not. In fact, according to the latest Standish Group Chaos Report, which came out earlier this year, they're seeing a sort of an alarming trend in the negative direction here, that 2/3 of all projects fail, meaning that they come in over budget, or they're late, or they're not delivering the features needed by the business. On the next slide, the reason for this, we think, is that it's fundamentally two things. One is that business users really don't know what they want until they see and interact with it. If the first time that they're seeing and interacting with a system is after it's already been designed, coded, tested, and through UAT, then obviously making changes is going to be very expensive. On the next slide, what we talk about is the second issue, is that the tools that business analysts use today to define complex software really are hard to interpret. Text specifications, use cases, screenshots. The business analyst is forced to sit down with the business stakeholder and try and figure out and elicit the right requirements for complex business systems, and using these tools, which fundamentally business users have a hard time interpreting. I think we've all been through the experience of sitting through a stakeholder review session where people are flipping through gigantic documents and nobody's really understanding what's in them. Unfortunately, the business analyst then turns around and gives these artifacts to downstream organizations that have just as much trouble understanding and interpreting them. So it's no wonder that projects are impacted. On the next slide, we see this all the time when business analysts walk into a review meeting with a giant 500-page binder of requirements. And is this really what we should be doing? On the next slide, we've talked about this a little bit already, but the impact is enormous in terms of impact to the business for sure, but also the impact to the business analyst. There's a lot of long hours, and you get little recognition or reward because when these projects go off the rails, guess who gets to spend more time on it? So it's really not a good situation. And on the next slide, we talk about, from our point of view, that visualization is really the solution. That you really have to figure out a way to get the business stakeholder to be able to see, but not only see, but interact with a mock-up, a full model of the proposed application early in the process. And what if you armed the business analyst with the ability to quickly assemble these high-fidelity mock-ups during the elicitation process so that there really isn't any confusion about what to build? And that's what Ionized does, is that we have a product that lets business analysts accomplish this very quickly. On the next slide, then, you can see that visualization can really transform the communication here, not only with the business stakeholder, but the visualization then becomes a very important artifact for communicating to downstream organizations. And not only does development get unconfused, but the QA and training and documentation groups get a head start on what they're doing as well. So visualization, along with the other artifacts, become a way to really transform the entire requirements process and empower the business analyst finally with a set of tools and collaborative platform that accelerates this whole process. Next slide. So at the end of the day, what visualization will let you do is quickly create a mock-up or a prototype of any kind of an application that has a user interface, whether it's a custom web application, a portal, or extensions to packaged applications. So good candidates for Ionized is any application with a user interface. Next slide. So with over 300 customers and 20,000 BAs using our product, what they're telling us is that using visualization as part of their standard process allows them to get to market twice as fast and virtually eliminate rework, which can be upwards of 30 or 40% of a project budget. So cost reduction is accomplished, time to market is accomplished, and whole organizations are transformed, as I think you'll hear from Brad. It really is a transformative technology that empowers business analysts to take a lead role in the design of new software systems. Next slide. So our vision is that very soon here, all business software is going to be visualized before and simulated before it's built. And you wouldn't dream of designing a new car or an airplane with drafting boards anymore. You would use CAD systems and 3D visualization and modeling systems. And that's a quick way to think about Ionized. It's CAD for business software, and we really need to leave our drafting boards behind. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brad Ryder, who co-leads the Advanced Technologies Group within Haworth. They're the ones that are spearheading the Ionized effort there globally, and he really gets involved in a lot of the different business units, which I think makes his job pretty interesting. And one of the really cool things about Haworth is that they've applied visualization across a broad spectrum of application types. Brad's been involved in web development for over 10 years in various roles, including mobile strategy and client vendor acquisition engagement and management, and more recently in the development of Haworth's UX strategy for customer-facing applications. So he's absolutely the right guy to be hearing from this morning. And Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Yeah, today I want to talk about adoption in probably a more practical way. I want to kind of walk through why we chose visualization and simulation as a practice within the organization, and talk more fundamentally, for us specifically, how we began to architect teams and that we continue doing. One thing I would say is that by no means what I'm presenting today is the silver bullet structure or architecture. We recognize from a social science perspective, every organization is a little bit different culturally. Everybody operates business a little bit differently. What I'm presenting today is potentially one approach to how you can begin to create something that we call the agency within. So let me tell you first a little bit about Haworth. We come from the contract furniture industry. We specialize in all components, interiors, raised flooring, movable walls, systems, furniture, seating. The list is pretty lengthy. But we were founded in 1948 by G.W. Haworth. We are privately owned, and it's still completely owned by the family, the Haworth family. Matthew Haworth, the youngest of the Haworths, is now our current chairman of the board. We are roughly about $1.6 billion in annual sales. We have about 7,500 members worldwide, and we're located in about 120 countries. We distribute product both depending on sectors in the world via dealer channel, and in some areas, Asia, Europe, direct. But it represents about 600 dealer entities within our channel, so you can very quickly get a sense of the complexity of distributing product and doing those sorts of things. And then we have 83 showrooms globally, ranging from some of these images here that Shanghai, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Milan, London, Luxembourg, New York, Chicago, a lot of different places. So Haworth is a fairly sizable organization, complex in nature given the product that we have, and a lot of different constituents that we have to serve in the marketplace, all the way from an end-user customer to an architectural design firm to a dealer to a designer. So we have a lot of different people, as well as our internal members that work within the company all around the world. So why this whole thing of visualization? One of the things that we've been working hard on for the last 5 years, we do a significant amount of software development within the organization for our dealers and our members specifically. And one of the things that we found in our process and our mechanism was we're doing a great deal of time of development work, but as Mitch pointed out, you always get to the end and it seemed to drag out longer than you wanted it to. It tended to be over budget. So Ann Harton, who is our CIO, who came on board approximately 5 years ago, she started proffering this idea around simulation and how we could potentially change in the nature that we do development. And we began to take the ball on this about a year ago. But one of the main things that I wanted to highlight are, 5 main reasons why we kind of chose to go this path. The big one is the requirements process was arduous. They were sometimes ambiguous and gray. And if you've been in software development for any amount of time, you kind of know that that's sort of the nature of the beast, and you kind of live with what you get. But we thought with simulation we had an opportunity to improve that process. We could improve the accuracy of the requirements, and in the end, the completeness of the application requirements would be far more thorough and accurate. The second one was to identify gaps in the product development lifecycle early, so reduce the overall project cycle time and the costs associated with it. What we were finding was that through the planning phases and everything else through the project cycle, we were spending a great deal of time on the requirements. We'd go ahead and begin executing. We end up revisiting requirements. We'd sit in this endless churn. And one of the things that we saw with the iRise platform was an opportunity to streamline the planning phases, we would have the ability to create this repository of reusable assets, templates, and project components that we could reuse. It would also get us ahead of the game, so we weren't waiting for a business unit to say, okay, we're ready to develop. We could actually begin pre-building or simulating way ahead of execution prior to the coding that would allow us to either shelf for real production time frame, or we could begin to execute right away. The other mantra that we live by is we thrash early because it's free. Seth Godin always said this was, thrash early because it's free, thrash late costs you a ton of money. And I think in software development we've all sort of lived that. And then the third part of this of reducing project cycle time was to get developers that were actually going to be coding product very quick and rapid understanding. And the example that I would use is that we'll show you a highlight of is that a particular project that we had, the summation of the requirements was about 375 pages. If you talk to any coder, most, I won't say all, but most will not read the 375 pages of requirements. They'll read highlights from it and then begin to articulate their actual product. Third reason, and a huge one for us, is we could improve user experience, which means we could get people involved earlier in the UX side or the user experience side and begin crafting applications more centered around user experience. We could validate, make changes quickly earlier in the process than actually coding, developing, deploying, and then getting response later in the game, which then limits your ability to go back and make changes without a lot of cost. The fourth one was to increase this communication and collaboration. We believe very heavily that the new model of development is about co-creation. And we think that co-creation is important because involving a lot of people up front, and we're seeing it from now bringing our roots in, from an architectural building perspective, the more people you have at the front end of the game in the design and the build perspective, the easier this goes. Everybody has a firm grasp and understanding of what's going to be delivered. Not only that, but then we all get a better understanding of what emotively drives each individual in the room. That helps us deliver more effective product as well. The fifth one is to engage users proactively. One of the things we found where we were able to identify opportunities to engage customers by sharing these simulations. So we were able to engage them and interact with them. And one of the biggest things that we found is when you can include your customers, and that can be, when I use the term customers, it could be internal, it could be external, and they allow them to influence your strategic direction on what you're creating. You suddenly get this sense of ownership by those individual people, which in return gives them this creation of loyalty. So we've found that that's been extremely powerful, and one of the reasons we were driving to do this. In the next slide, everyone, I think, has seen some iterative of this. This development lifecycle takes on a bunch of different forms, from business idea to the business requirements, and we've all lived through this process to some extent where business requirements are thrashed about, trying to figure out what's next. What are the individual drivers to make this successful? Why would it be successful? What's the return on investment? To the next phase where we get into functional requirements, and we spend a great deal of time thrashing about what are the technical things that need to happen on a particular application. Need to have a search functionality that does this, and to begin to explain what that means to a business unit that may not be involved in day-to-day software development, what that exactly means. To the third phase, when we get into actually designing user interface, to developing and then going back out and validating and then eventually deploying. And we use these circuitous shapes to represent that there's a continuous thrashing that goes about in each of these areas, which builds in time, and eventually if you're using, whether it be internal or third party, but more importantly third party, considerable amounts of cost. And you'll see very quickly that the involvement ranges in this, and it happens in chunks. So we talk about the corporate business unit is typically involved, obviously, with their idea, but they're involved with business requirements, functional requirements, and design. And then, as coders, we kind of go up to the magic mountaintop and develop, and we bring our beautiful product back down to validate. Corporate business units like, no, that's incorrect. And we end up thrashing some more on changes. And then you've got this next group, which is the development team or the project manager. And we found particular in our case that the development team is involved in these business requirements where they're there just to listen. So, in our practice where we're paying, people and coders good money, the last thing we want to do is actually have them sitting through listening to a business just do requirements. We really want them coding. And yet they're involved with the business requirements, functional requirements, the design, the development, the validation, and deployment. So from a bandwidth perspective, we're using them across a pretty huge swath of this life cycle. And then my favorite one is whether it's an executive stakeholder or a higher level stakeholder. Traditionally, whether it be within our organization or any other company I've worked with, the executive stakeholder typically won't come in until the design stage. Well, you've done a considerable amount of work up to this point, and they may ask you to go react to some of their opinions or their observations, and then you're going back and changing business requirements. Very little do we see the product or the product consumer, is what we call it, the consumer of the actual product, involved in the design stage in our traditional development lifecycle. They're typically here. It's where we would actually show them an alpha or a beta of a product, and they would test it and give us feedback, and we go back and change appropriately. I love this statement by Albert Einstein that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And in the development world, I think we constantly try to figure out different ways of doing the process under the same constraints, under the same methodologies, thinking that we're going to get some magic silver bullet result. When we looked at the iRise platform, we knew that we needed to disrupt dramatically. And I am here to tell you that this is not an easy process in a lot of places because traditional development is sort of rooted deep into the organization. But I think what we're finding is if you can get some alignment with different parts of your organization, you can collapse this development lifecycle and, for the sake of simplicity, begin to collapse it from idea to development, where we're collapsing into it business requirements and functional requirements, then design, and we're involving the BU in that process, the business unit, the executive stakeholder, and the product consumer, all in this process. And we're in this co-creation model. And this doesn't always go smoothly because it is a behavioral change, but I think the big thing is in a design-build methodology, if you get everybody in the room, you can get all the issues out on the table ahead of time and find out where you need to go a whole lot quicker than doing it into a silo approach. And then the big thing is we get our development team focused on what they do extremely well, and that's actually coding and deploying and doing all that post-launch activity. So I'm going to walk through a couple things that I'm going to show you three things that we've been working on the iRise platform. Very diverse points of view. We're a SAP house, and again, we have 600 plus dealers, and so at some point we need to give dealers visibility into the organization on things that they've ordered. And so we have a current project in play right now that we're using iRise in segments of it. And we've used it more to clarify points of issue in the requirements. This has been a project that's been ongoing for about 2 years now. And this is what I'm showing you are obviously mock-ups that we did. And this was after about 10 months of thrashing with an outside organization. What we did is we were doing a proof of concept around simulation. So we pulled in SAP expertise, our consultants that were part of that team, our dealer network into a room, and we began to model out what this interface ought to look like. So it's not supposed to be beautiful and pristine. We're talking about really raw data that we're articulating. But what we wanted dealers to be able to do was be able to see into our system actual orders that they had. We wanted to articulate some scenarios of if I needed to look for things, how could I do that? And then the most important thing to them was the dashboard to be able to view into our system. So I wanted to be able to see things that were highlighted red, yellow, green, things I needed as a dealer to react to that had to do with my customer, whether it be pre-order, so I'm designing something and I'm entering some data that may have gone incorrect that I need to correct, if there's pricing errors or that type of thing. So this entire visualization session really helped us get their heads around what we were actually going to be creating longer term for them. And they had some say in the development, which was powerful. So let me talk about mobile platforms. We, in the last year, have brought on a web strategist into our team and has put a lot of energy around this mobile strategy, which I think is new for the business. And definitely when you talk about iPhone and the emerging of this technology and how wildly successful I think the application development side has been, there was forethought in seeing that we needed to develop something from a mobile perspective. And so we focused highly on very simple application. We were very intentional about why we were doing what we were doing. And we used the Ionized platform primarily for our interaction with our end developer that was actually creating it with us. And I'm showing you one particular screen that we were talking about. That was our home menuing system, which was, quite honestly, probably the hardest aspect of doing this application, because we had to figure out the most fluid way to get into the application and begin to create some of these screens. And what we ended up with is what you're seeing here. So I'm showing you very quickly some entry screens and the final navigation that came into play. And this is really about an image viewer and the ability to interact with showrooms, so the ability to call a map, as well as look at product and product details, and to be able to share that from a mobile platform perspective with other people. So on the mobilization side, we're using iRise to begin to simulate across multiple platforms, because we want to be about being data agnostic. So whatever platform we deliver it to, we want to be able to deliver this rich user experience depending on the audience. That particular iPhone application was designed for the architectural design community, and its sole purpose was to inspire with these photographic shots of some of our global showrooms. Next was Haworth.com, and this just launched back in June of this year, and this was a huge effort. And when we talk about complexity of design, iRise, when we came in and we were beginning to launch our practice, Haworth.com had already been in motion for quite some time. We were using an external design firm to do the research, as well as some of the initial design. And so we were very quickly trying to ramp up speed and to come in alignment with them. But we began to articulate some of these mock-ups, and what I'm showing you is basically a series of iterations that came to be for something we call gray spaces, which was again about highlighting client spaces and our own spaces. And so we very much, in a sort of a wireframe low fidelity mode, began to hash out what should this begin to look like. So as we go through this, we kind of started laying out, and we go from this boxy textual view, low fidelity, into beginning to lay in some higher resolution graphics, figuring out our navigation, what content should go here. Our headers get cleaned up on how we're going to do navigation in the top nav bar to the final product, which is on Haworth.com today. And so you can see very closely or very clearly that when we moved through the iterations, when we got to our final fidelity iteration within iRise, we had some pretty good consensus of how it should feel and look. And that helped the team get around, okay, so how should this all be laid out? And so the team got there fairly quickly on what we were doing. So in the Ionized Visualization side, these are some of the very core reasons that we got to doing simulation. And again, we are so in our infancy about this, but what we're finding is that simulation is helping us accelerate the finding of issues. It's allowing us to tweak design earlier than later. It's allowing us to get our constituents aligned with products that we're creating. We're getting into this co-creation design build model that allows people to get involved in the process. Second part of what I wanted to talk about, so the why visualization. We definitely wanted to talk about the importance of team architecture because we believe this is probably paramount in the design of using iRise. You can bring in a multitude of software tools into your business, but you really get a 50-50 chance of its success unless you do something about how you're going to structure your teams. And we're still working through this, and we're still figuring out each other's rhythm. It's almost like a first date. We're kind of figuring out how everybody functions and works. And we do have our hiccups, but we're continually refining our interactions with one another and helping define the process and how it flows. So we're taking this old legacy way of development, and we're really beginning to turn how we're actually talking about doing it. So let me talk about how it looks today. We have three segments of the business, and actually not today, but probably, let's say, 2 years ago. We had the corporate business units, which could be anybody from finance to marketing to HR to dealer development. Those would be our corporate business units. We, up to about a year ago, didn't have a PMO, but we had this group of project managers. And then we had our development team. And so, as we all know, corporate business units, they're ultimately the product owners, and their sole goal in life is speed to market. We got to have it right. We got to move, get it done, get it out the door. Well, that runs into conflict when you talk about a project manager, and I know this firsthand because our sole goal is we have to manage budget, manage scope, got to manage timing and resources, which can be an incredible rub to the product owners because it feels a bit arduous and black and white and very linear and things. And to a certain extent it is. And then we have our development team, and their ultimate goal is to design a great product, but they want the requirements to be locked in before they actually get it and start working, because nothing angers more a development team than when you start changing requirements after they've half-coded an application. So inevitably, what we wanted to always happen is we always wanted a corporate business unit or the product owners to come up with these ideas, kick it off with project management, help gather these requirements, define the entire project, get corporate sponsorship from an executive or director level, approve a budget, and then kick it off with the development team. That's how you would love it to go. But in reality, that's not how it goes. In our case, what we ended up finding is a lot of our business units were all going outside of the process and to third parties that would help them define the concept and the requirements. And what would end up happening is you would, as a project manager or development team, you begin to hear rumblings in the organization about these applications that were being built out in your organization for different groups that had third-party people attached, no continuity of what those developers were, no consistency in branding and user interface. And what I love right now is that we're beginning to get our hands around the branding and the consistency of our applications, and we're beginning to leverage some of these people. So what we've begun to do is outline our process, and I'm going to show you sort of our beginning step of what we did and then where we believe we need to go. So we had really three teams when we first articulated, which would be an old model. We still have corporate business units, which are the product owners. We now have this iRise Studio team, which is about facilitation, gathering visual requirements, and modeling those, and then tweaking those as we go. We now officially have a PMO and a project management group that help sort of do logistics and product logistics or project logistics. We have a design studio or group that focuses on user interface or user experience. that's part of this web studio team that actually does, at the end of the day, the coding and the development of the final product. And then they will also do post-launch support. So when we look at this, the product owners ultimately, and what we're still defining, is product strategy and objectives. So what should the product, what's the strategy around it, what do we want it to do, and the objectives that it needs to meet. They also need to be able to provide for us audience definition. One thing that the web strategist and her group began doing was really researching in these personas, which is extremely valuable because it becomes the cornerstone of all your development. So I would highly recommend, if you don't do personas today, do personas for everything that you do. It gives you a good cornerstone to build your applications against. In the iRise team, the way we're doing it is we have 2 tiers of fidelity modeling requirements. We have this sort of low fidelity box text wireframes, and then what we call medium fidelity, where we're introducing some FPO imagery and whatever it may be into the application. We're also doing requirements linking and notation. So we're still doing some textual requirements to support the modeling. The project manager then is in charge of project induction into the development team, ultimately responsible for budget, resource planning, how much is going to cost internally versus do we need to go externally to get it developed. They may also do asset acquisition of different components that need to go into the model. They also conduct user testing and training. So once the product is actually developed, they may actually at the end of this cycle do that type of training. Our UI person then will do the 3rd tier of fidelity modeling, the pixel perfect model that would begin to take in all the designs, sliced up graphics, and then we begin to apply it into the model for final design approval. Of course, the development team then is doing product architecture. What platform is it going to sit on? They're going to actually do the code development, code testing, and then the post-launch support, bug management, and then identify new feature identifications. So they'll identify new features that are brought back by the team. What we're finding is that we need to begin operating more like a cohesive studio. And in recent days here, we've been talking about what that means. So let me just show you kind of a model where we're beginning to compress these teams together. And we think there's some value in actually coexisting together in a physical space together, and we're talking about what that means. But the big thing that we added was at the front end is we added this thing called project advocacy. And it's a little bit different than project management because it's not about just resource planning. But this individual is about advocating the use of iRise, the methodology, the process. They also do this persona validation, and when there's holes in the personas that we're missing, they would actually do development. And then the next iteration of what we believe we need to do is this lifecycle usability testing. Usability testing helps us validate what we built was the right thing and that people are using it correctly. We're also including in the facilitation of modeling this UI or UX, user interface or user experience individual, into the modeling process versus this tossing off to the next group to work with. And then from a project management, we're aligning and linking the same person that's doing advocacy and project management to hand off. And we're beginning, so the idea of the agency within, where this whole concept came from, was this idea of we're compressing into one studio and we're beginning to act like what an agency would. So when a business unit comes to us, the intent here is that we begin to do budget and quoting. So if you have a project, we begin to talk about what that looks like from a cost perspective, how we resource plan, when we can start, and all those elements. So in closing, I want to just talk about 4 pieces of what, at least from our experience so far, elements for success. The big thing is recognize as a journey. The fact that you install a piece of software and have an individual in your organization doesn't change how your organization does development. It's a behavioral change, and this doesn't happen overnight. It's not about just process. It means about people getting together and actually working together and working through what this means to the development process and how you guys go through the process of development, especially using iRise as the enabler to speed up the requirements process, the design validation process. Secondly, which is which is my favorite and sometimes my hardest thing to do, is communicate, communicate, communicate. And when you've communicated, communicate some more. The biggest mistake that I think I made when we started the iRise process is we didn't communicate enough, and we didn't really level expectations, make realistic expectations, and be ready, because even when you do all these things, people won't believe what you're doing is the right thing. Tying with that, partnership between your executives, between your teams, and your consumers. The big thing is, when you're doing iRise, make sure you have executive sponsorship. You can't do this in a vacuum. And the earlier you can get people involved in the process, doing design build, having your stakeholders in the room, you got to have executives that love being part of the final design review, involved in the front-end sessions that you're actually doing your joint application designs. We call them JAD sessions, where you're doing all these requirements gathering. If they're not going to participate, we strongly recommend that you do some sort of contract that gives you the right to say you can't come into the design process and make changes. And that takes a lot of trust between you and your executive teams to be able to do that. And lastly, become an evangelist, a simulation evangelist, and it's about consistency in message. And the big thing is you've got to be tenacious about the end objective. If simulation is the direction you're going, you have to be wholeheartedly committed to it. You can't do it 50%, because your failure rate will go up exponentially if you only in it for 20% of the game. You only do it for part of the projects, because we find when we have entered halfway through a project, it becomes extremely painful. So evangelize the organization around this idea of what simulation. It means that you got to do those communication practices constantly and over again. And if you don't have an evangelist, somebody that's good at it, get one. Find somebody that can understand simulation, understand the power of this revolutionary thinking, bring them to the table and have them talk consistently throughout the organization of what it means. So in closing, I'll hand it off to Mitch, and I think we're going to do a Q&A at this point. So that's the end of my presentation at this point.
Thanks very much, Brad. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions that have come in, and I just wanted to remind everybody that there's a question panel on your screen. You can go ahead and submit your questions at any time. We've got a lot of questions. I can already tell you that we're not going to get to everybody in terms of an answer live here, but rest assured that Brad and I will work our way through these questions and make sure to reach out to everybody after the fact for the ones that we don't get to today. So, hey, Brad, I'll try and group some of these together. There's a set of questions from folks on how does visualization fit into an Agile or Agile-like environment. And is that the kind of process methodology that you guys have at Haworth?
Good question. We've actually kicked off using Agile methodology here in the last year. And the way we're using it is very similar in the iRise environment. So when we're actually doing some of the upfront work in the simulation models, we're actually creating product backlogs of all the feature sets, and we actually chunk those into a product backlog and begin working on each of those elements. Mm-hmm. So we begin to identify those early. And then as a team, we begin to work through each of those products as we go through the process. So we're using a form of Agile. The other one that we're extremely interested in is Agile UX, and some of my counterparts that are probably on this call will be a little floored that I use that, but sort of mashing up this idea of user experience in Agile in developing not only product features but tying them to user experience. So Agile is something we're committed to. It's something that we're practicing within the iRise environment. In fact, I know there's another session that talks about Agile and iRise that's available as a webinar that I would strongly encourage, because there are other people that have been doing it a little bit longer that have got some good traction on how to do it. But it is something that we're using, yes.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, thanks for the plug on the other web seminars. There is content on our site that talks about how visualization does fit into an Agile environment, and we've got a lot of customers that are moving to rapid iterative approaches Some are more, religiously adhering to Agile than others, but I think what we're talking about here is rapid iteration around collaborative teams. And to some extent, I think that kind of methodology, Brad, is really meant to kind of solve some of the endemic problems with a waterfall approach. And interestingly, companies that haven't moved to Agile but have adopted visualization are telling us that visualization makes waterfall work precisely because you're kind of moving the interaction with the final product much earlier in the cycle. So lots to be talked about there. We have whole web seminars just on that topic. A couple of questions about Haworth. Where do the BAs live in this whole process, Brad, and how are they integrated into are they part of the PMO or are they part of another group?
No, the BAs actually, our group specifically, the Advanced Technology Group, was designed to be the intermediary between ISIT and primarily the business units. So our BAs reside between, we report under the structure of IT, but what we've begun doing is taking BAs out of the business units. So for instance, I actually just brought somebody on that's actually reporting up through the marketing organization, and she is doing the BA role as a marketer perspective, which is extremely interesting from our point of view because not everything is a technical thing. So the BAs, in our organization reside both on the IT side and, the business unit side. And we believe that's really effective, getting the right perspective at the right time.
Got it. There's a class of questions coming in about how quickly can BAs and UX professionals adopt a new technology like iRise and visualization. Maybe you can relate your experience with your team there. What was the process you used in training the folks and adopting it?
Yeah, I encourage, any new platform. I've always been a big self-learner, but I think when you talk about doing something this radical, I think the best thing we do, shameless plug for iRise, but we really worked well with your professional services group when we did a mentoring program with iRise. So we had some great individuals out of Chicago and Indianapolis that mentored our BAs. And really what we did is we took 3 or 4 projects and sat down and worked through them. And our BAs were hands-on through the life cycle of those little projects to kind of get a feel of how this should work and flow. They also participated in some of these facilitation practice events where they actually got to see, well, how does that flow and how does that work? So I highly recommend getting aligned with iRise to do mentoring, which was extremely valuable. The one thing I will say, if you have a really great BA that's a good process person and understands software, you'd be amazed at what they can get started doing. And my story is a gentleman named Tim who comes from the SAP side of the house. He's a process guy. And he's actually been using iRise to clarify requirements within a particular project. And we handed basically the keys to the vehicle saying, you need to go through this mentoring session. But he got started right away and began using the tool and very quickly got up to speed. What I mean by quickly, within 4 to 6 weeks, and with his normal tasks that he has to do, in using the tool set and articulating for external development groups on what needed to actually be done. But I think mentoring is super important. I think you can do a certain amount on your own. But again, the resources provided on the iRise website through iDocs, the webinars are helpful to get your footing on what you need to do.
Yeah, and I would add that we offer free e-learning from our site as well, which is a path I think maybe that wasn't available when you first started with iRise, but you can take both a beginner and advanced class through free e-learning directly available from the iRise site. The iDocs that Brad mentioned are self-contained, encapsulated simulations that are freely downloadable from our site as well, and you can import those into your iRise installation and use those as guides for how to do commonly simulated things. And with the training, with the iDocs, with the videos, and the mentoring guide that's available, a lot of our customers tell us that within 2 or 3 days, their business analysts become basically proficient with the product, and then after using it for 2 or 3 weeks on their first project, they become much more of an advanced user. So hopefully that answers that group of questions about iRise.
Yeah, Mitch, hey, one additional comment on that one, because I think you hit on something that's really key, is one thing that we've learned is don't reinvent the wheel. And I think the community of iRise people that are out there, what I love about this community is that we're all about sharing our components. And so you'll see a lot of people sharing their iDocs, problems like, how do I do drag and drop simulation within an application, and leveraging some of those components that have already been built and sort of troubleshot by people is use them wherever you can. I mean, that's what I love about this community, is that we're not trying to create from scratch new thought. So,
yeah. A lot of process questions, Brad, so I'm going to try and get to as many of these as possible. But what are the benefits of using iRise to create visualizations over traditional wireframes? In other words, wouldn't polished visualizations require that BAs either have or have access to graphic design skills?
Yes and no. Okay, so because I came from a world where we did wireframing and we did the very traditional approach. One of the things that I can't do with wireframes is I can't make them functional. And one of the things that we like about iRise is not only do we get these great wireframes of where do things get bucketized and contained, but then what is their functionality? So the ability to articulate, for instance, a great example, how do I do a drag and drop sort of interaction with a wireframe and be able to show what that does, is the power of the simulation. Because I can tell you that it's drag and drop, but until I make that real, you don't really know what the implications of that are. In the dream world of simulation, if you could mash up a human being into one person, you want them to be part BA, part process person, part user experience, user interface person, and somebody that can facilitate a meeting. But those are hard to come by in this market anywhere. So I think the fact that you align some of your resources that have those skill sets and they agree on the methodology or the idea of how to do it, you can begin to incorporate them into the process. So really the wireframing, you're still doing that to a certain extent, but from our perspective, we're trying to breathe life into the wireframes to give it its functionality so I can show how data gets represented and how you can interact with that, or how to drag and drop and do those types of things.
Right. Quick question for you. Did iRise replace all of your requirements artifacts, including use cases and sequence diagrams and data models, or is iRise, augmenting these other artifacts? It's easy for me to say.
We're sort of at a crossroads. I mean, because we still have parts of the organization, and because our group is fairly small, we obviously can't do everything that has to be done in the organization. But what we have committed to is that any new web development, so that would be web application or outwardly facing website, would be developed in iRise, and we're using that as a practice to start while we build this team. So there are parts of the organization that still do very traditional use case scenarios, UML they're using, and they're definitely using traditional practices. Because frankly, we just don't have the bandwidth to do everything the organization requires.
So, that's interesting. So how's Haworth addressing the challenge of changing the behaviors of folks, not only on the BA and UX side, but on the business stakeholder side, by introducing visualization into the process? What's working best for you?
I think the big thing that we're finding is, and it depends on the group, but when we sit in a room, I'll use that SAP interface, for instance. When we sat in the room, our clarity of understanding of the requirements from a business user perspective was elevated to such a point that people, I have quotes that I'd love to share with you, but some of the quotes out of there, they felt like they got more done, and this is a quote, so this isn't me, they got more done in 4 hours than they were able to, even comprehend they did in 10 months. And so this ability to get their thinking aligned with what the product was extremely valuable. And I think it's those types of sessions when you get people involved and expose them to what it can be. That's, one point that I didn't make is demo whenever you can. Take an application that you're working on and have people participate. We created this thing that we called the observation deck within our facilitation sessions that allowed people to come in and actually watch how this actually all happens. And we're making that more of a practice for our facilitation to get exposure. But that's how we're also doing adoption within the organization.
Yeah, I mean, that just makes sense. It seems like good internal marketing is also a strong tactic, if you will, for getting behavior to change.
Yep.
Another question here, how do you handle change management and enhancements?
I'm guessing from the simulation itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's from the point of view of the visualization. Once you have like your iPhone application, if you've got changes to it, do you keep the simulation in lockstep with the production view, and then when you make enhancements, just make changes to the visualization?
Yeah, exactly. So what we end up doing we use Definition Center, which is a central server location for all of our iRise simulations. And what we'll do is we'll have one working production model, and then we'll work into subfolders of, whether it be enhancement version 1.1, and we'll basically take the production environment, duplicate it in that one, make the enhancements, and go through, the same iterative process of what the enhancements should be. But then we see the implications to the actual production simulation, which I think is a good way to go. And that's how we're attacking it. It may not be the perfect way for everybody, but for right now, we believe that's probably the best way to do it.
Got it. I think we have time for one more question, and this is a common one that I see a lot, but I've actually witnessed this. When you show a visualization early in the process to the business stakeholders, and they get really excited, do you have any issues explaining to them that it's not working code and that the application actually has to then be fully architected and design coded and tested?
Yeah, there is the disconnect. So if you haven't had a chance to communicate what it is and then you start seeing this whole working thing, we do often get asked is, now this is all coded, ready to go, and we have to, explain very, in the process that we hand this off to development. But what we do articulate is the speed for development. And you ask any of our developers, they actually like having iRise because they don't have to read the requirements, because they already know when they look at a particular function on a page, they know what that's supposed to do just by clicking on it, and they know exactly how to code it. So I think you work very closely at setting expectation that it's not a real thing. But like for us, when we create new furniture, I never write a whole list of requirements. We design three-dimensionally. We say this is it, and everybody knows that it still has to go to engineering for tooling, and it has to get created and all those things. So it's part of the natural development process. But it's good to bring people through the journey so they know where the handoff is. But
right,
yeah, we run into those issues.
Yeah, and same kind of issue with, can you create a visualization for something that can't be built, and that's very rarely the case. I think best practice, as you point out, is a collaborative partnership between development and the business and the business analysts and the designers to rapidly iterate on the visualization, and then everybody goes off and gets a head start on what they're doing. So with that, I think we've probably run out of time for questions, and I'll turn it back over to Adrienne.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you again for attending this Modern Analyst webinar, and many thanks again to Brad and Mitch for a very informative presentation. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event. We hope you have a great day.